I am so excited about this panel. This panel came about through brainstorming between Arun and me about John's panel. And I said, but one of the things that I really think we need to think more about is communicating performance information. And to link this back to the GPRA and, our what have we learned from GPRA, et cetera, basically, as I said, we started and we didn't do much communication about the performance information. And then we got these plans and reports, but they were compliance exercises. And then we ended up having the Bush administration's part reviews, but everybody's attention got distracted to the part scores rather than were we actually making progress. And we launched performance.gov. And let's be honest, when we launched it, it was more to get the agencies to have a structure for the way they were thinking and what they were communicating. But it's not like we expected a whole lot of users, but it's a lot of years later. And I think the new performance.gov has gotten better. It's evolved. And I think that's one of our challenges. And the great thing here is, let's think about how we want to evolve. What is the performance of, what is the objective? What is the goal of communicating performance? Who are the users? Who is the uses? What have we learned about that? What makes these kinds of systems stick and how much is communication important? So to assemble this panel, Arun and I brainstormed. I looked for some of the program, efforts that I'd known had been very successful in the past to sort of see if they still were out there, and just poked around state websites and local websites. And we have a killer panel for you. We will start with David Gottesman we're going to start with Ben Henderson from Colorado, where you had a governor who was very big on performance management, but then he ran for Senate, I think. He's no longer the governor. You have a transition, but you still have some really interesting stuff happening there. And, I mentioned this because, we had, and Dave Gottesman will speak from Montgomery County, but when Martin O'Malley was in Maryland, state stat became such a big issue politically for him that when the new governor came in, he couldn't keep state stat. We actually intentionally did not name the federal work we were doing as stat because we didn't want it to disappear. Excuse me. So we'll start with Ben Henderson, whom you see now. He's Director of Operations and Cabinet Affairs in the Colorado Governor's Office. We will then move from Ben Henderson. Well, I asked Utah, Dave Fletcher, the Chief Technology Officer in the Utah Department of Government, in the Operations Division of Technology Services, will talk next, where they've done some very interesting things. I just found them by literally poking around and LinkedIning these two guys. Dave Gottesman will be next. I have worked with him over the years. As I said before, he not only is in Montgomery County, where he's been doing the sort of leading this effort for years, but he's also head of the one of the leaders, the co-founders of the Mid-Atlantic StatNet Network, which brings these, Mid-Atlantic state and local governments together. And then Brianna Surud, who is from Amherst, Mass, who's been working more on engagement. And so we've asked her to join us and share with you their thoughts. So the system we've come up with is I've asked everybody to take 10 minutes, and I'm going to put my little timer on. I'll put my finger up if you're past time. Each of you to take 10 minutes. And then I've asked each of the presenters to ask one of the other presenters a question. So Dave, let me toss it to you to get us started. I'm sorry, Ben, I'm tossing to you to get it started. And oh, by the way, guys, put your questions in the chat if you want, or just raise your hand. We will have time for questions at the end. Go for it, Ben.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Metzenbaum. Let me know if you can see my screen.
You're good.
So as you mentioned, the governor's dashboard and some of the work here in Colorado started actually well before Governor Hickenlooper's time. We passed a piece of legislation in 2010, which was then modified in 2013, and they call it the SMART Act, the Smart Government Act. It's one of the things that I'm tasked with doing in my role is managing compliance with the SMART Act for all state agencies. And you can see it's an acronym, right? State Measurement for Accountable, Responsive, and Transparent Government. That act actually incorporated a lot of activity from our legislative stakeholders, from our nonprofit community. We have partnerships with higher education here in the state, and they provide resources and data analysis help to kind of build a momentum that we're really proud of here in Colorado. And we keep getting better year over year. And so I'm excited to kind of talk about the way that Governor Polis has taken things in the last 3 years of his administration. Fundamentally, though, this process has been the same for the past decade or so. The legislation requires that every agency create a performance plan. So you can see some of those performance plans here. We then take those performance plans and verbatim, although it requires, a bunch of different things, we take the strategic goals, which are 2 or 3 of the most important things that agencies are working on, and we literally take the data and put it on the governor's dashboard. So that dashboard.colorado.gov is the URL, and we can send that out here. But you can see here a screenshot of our dashboard for the Department of Corrections. The audience for this dashboard is the public. We envision this to be a way for the public in Colorado to engage with what state agencies are doing. And you can see they have 3 goals here on the top. The decrease recidivism is a goal that we've had. And very specifically, we're measuring the 1-year return rate. And they're also focused on increase access to telehealth services. And they also have some goals around staffing, reducing turnover for their correctional officers. And we have strategic goals and strategies and leading indicators, but the dashboard itself measures about the 70 or 80 most important things that our administration is working on at any given point in time. And we spend 3 or 4 months really going through a process where we set those goals every year to make sure that they really are the most important things we're looking at. All in all, the dashboard holds about 400 indicators, but all of those are the strategies that lead up to the 70 or 80 most important things we're measuring every year. We also build a structure where every metric is reviewed in some sort of management meeting every single month. If we're going to measure it, it means it's important. That means we're going to take the time to, from an operational standpoint, address whether things are looking good or whether they need some improvement or whether we need some more analysis or resources. The dashboard itself is the tool we use in many of those management meetings. So you can imagine us sitting at the head of the table with the Department of Corrections and the Department of Public Safety, the Department of Labor and Employment, Medicaid, SNAP, all sitting around the table together, and we would pull up a dashboard that is the website, the same thing that the public sees, and go through the measures to determine what's going well and what needs more work. But because the audience is the public, we tend to focus on making things look good over time, showing positive progress over time. We use the colors blue and green to kind of show that things are getting better. So that dashboard then gets turned around and becomes what we call agency scorecard. So this is the internal facing document, but it's important to note that it's the exact same data. We literally take the same charts, and so you can see exactly the same thing I showed you on the last slide. This is the same information shown in a different format to be internally facing. And actually, this is the document that we attach to a cabinet director's annual evaluation as well. So it literally, we print it out as a PDF and attach it to say, it's a small percentage of their overall annual performance rating. It's accomplishing the most important things that they've set out for this year. Again, every metric is reviewed every month. This document, because it is meant for one-on-one conversations between the chief of staff and the governor and the cabinet member, we can lean in a little bit more on fixing problems, surfacing those problems, letting us know where the problems are. So we use greens and reds. And then because we're focused on the most important things and using our performance management work, using our data analytics work, using all the different tools in our analysis tool belt, process improvement, agile, lean, we actually take the wins from those achievements, what we call wildly important goals from the 4 disciplines of execution and Chris McChesney, and we celebrate them in communications documents. So here you can see a tweet. The Department of Transportation had a goal for improving rural roads, and they surpassed that goal. And so we celebrated them when they surpassed that goal and bragged about them publicly, just to show exactly how the performance indicators move from, statutory obligation, public facing, internal facing, and then back to communications to celebrate that win. I do want to spend just a minute talking about some of the differences we see between how we show things on the public facing site and how we show things on the internal facing documents, what we call these artifacts, these scorecards. And so I'll use an example about our Just Transition office. the state of Colorado has set some pretty ambitious goals as it relates to climate change. Happy Earth Day, everybody. By 2040, we expect to have 100% renewable energy in our electric grid. And by 2050, we have a goal to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 90%. We know that those pretty bold goals are going to create some disruption for our local economies and in our workforce. And so we are intentional about fixing that. And so we've created an office within our Department of Labor and Employment called the Colorado Just Transition Office, which provides local economic development tools, things like bringing in new businesses, things like doing work, training, upskilling, new licensing and credentialing. There's resources that we provide to these local communities to help the workers who are working today in oil and gas and coal transition into the economy that will be the future for Colorado. Now, when we tell that story to the public, because it is around our environment goals, around our greenhouse gas emissions, around our 100% renewable energy goals, we take this office and tell the story from an environment and renewables perspective. But because most of the work is actually local economic development, labor and employment, upskilling, workforce goals, when I'm running the business, that same metric actually shows up in a different artifact on our rural economic development cabinet scorecard, which you can see there on the right. There's just an indication of how we talk about our goals differently for the public than we do internally. The goal's the same, the number's the same, the metric's the same, the target's the same. We just tell the story differently than we run the business. Dr. Mensenbaum, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about our audience and our engagement. And so here is the users of our dashboard. Since we did a refresh and the analytics kind of refreshed back in early 2021, you can see when we first did that refresh, you can see we had about 1,200 users on a good week, and we were promoting it relatively frequently in social media. Since then, the users have dropped down to about 500 a week. But we know that a lot of those folks are the state employees who are reviewing the data in our management meetings that we're using, right? So some of these users are state employees. So, right, we're using the data. It's there. It's important for our business, how we run things. You can see that almost all of those users are using it Monday through Friday during business hours. Although weirdly enough, I guess some people are using our dashboard till about 10 p.m. on Mondays. And this is longitudinal data from the beginning of when we did it. And we know that about 3/4 of our folks use it through the desktop, and about 1/4 use it through their mobile phones. 95% of all of our users actually come from the United States, and 66% of all users are from Colorado. And you can see here that that's spread out across the entire state. The majority where our state capital is, where people are using the data regularly, but we have users, both state employees and the public, viewing this information, looking at it regularly all across the state, and we're proud of that. The last thing I want to demonstrate is something exciting to get excited about. We believe that we're really just on the cusp here of what performance and data analysis and data-driven decision-making can be. If you look at the way the private sector is moving, and you look at the way that the public sector has adopted some of the private sector innovations, in probably 5 or 6 years, we will have the kinds of business intelligence and analytics to drive real results and real outcomes in incredibly meaningful ways. Predicting exactly when someone needs an intervention from a policy perspective or needs that new social service, how we can drive utilization up, things like Medicaid and SNAP. I want to demonstrate one example that we're kind of getting excited about. It's called data sonification. So instead of showing you a chart, showing you the data in a visible way, I'm going to let you hear the data in a sonic way. And what I'm going to use is unemployment claims. So we have a call center, right, accepting calls every day for people who are out of work. They need a little help. They just need a hand up to figure out exactly what their next career step will be. And I will play some of these. So I've taken the throughput of our call center and I've turned it into a metronome, basically. That's all I've done. I've sped it up a little bit so we're not sitting here for more than 10 minutes because I promised to make it less than 10 minutes. But I'm going to play 3 different rates. And the first rate is really an average year. So this is 2019 from the call center from our unemployment office. Every click is a person, is a human being picking up the phone saying, I need help. I really, I just need a little assistance from the government. And can you help me, right? So this is an average year. This is what our call center expects without, kind of global crises and pandemics. Oh, This next one is the peak of the housing crisis in 2009. So what many of us thought would be a generational economic crisis, and you can hear what the unemployment claims sounded like then. Much faster, right? You can imagine the kind of staff increases you need and how much more work you need to provide to make sure that that's working well. The last one here is COVID. So this is the peak of COVID in 2020, and you can hear what an unemployment rate of more than 12% sounded like in Colorado. So you can see just how different that would be, how different you have to run the operations, and how we can begin to communicate performance in a way that actually kind of drives different thinking and different problem solving. And I know that's my time.
And now I'm going to toss to David Fletcher, the Chief Technology Officer at Utah Department of Government, Operations Division of Technology Services.
Okay, it's nice to be with you all. Arun, are you able to put up the slides?
Yes, Ben, just give me 1 second. Sorry.
Dave, why don't you tell folks how long you've been with the state?
Yeah, I've been with Utah for 32 years. Started out in the Department of Administrative Services, but I've been the Chief Technology Officer for the last 16 years. And about 30 years ago, when Netscape browser came out, we put together our first website and sort of been doing that ever since, because I think, I mean, for me, it's been the ability to scale government and do things differently, and really it's all about performance. So that's what intrigued me about the conference here is how we can use technology to improve performance. So I thought I'd start out talking about the next slide there, Arun, if you can go to that. Until last year, we'd had 12 years of the Gary Herbert administration, our governor, and I think this is where our focus on performance really matured in a way that it became a little more scientific and technology driven. When Governor Herbert came on board, they changed the name of the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget to Management and Budget. And so it took on a much more hands-on approach in terms of looking at the way we do things. And shortly thereafter, they began to implement something that we called the Success Framework. And we used to have a website, success.utah.gov. It was sort of a little bit like performance.gov, but really focused on the methodologies and a framework for how we achieve performance. And the administration had a target when they implemented this of achieving a 25% improvement in government. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but there was an increased focus on evidence-based decision making. Every year we would have what we called the annual ops conference, and all state agencies sent their management teams, and we would review new ideas about performance and how we could achieve greater success through increased performance. And if you want to go to the next slide, Arun, I'll talk a little bit about the approach at this time was really how we use a methodology to achieve this 25% improvement, and how we can measure that and show it and communicate it. The Governor's Office of Management and Budget had every agency use the theory of constraints, quality and throughput over OE, operational efficiency, or operational expense, excuse me. But basically the idea was that using a formula, increasing quality, increasing throughput, and decreasing operational expense that somehow we were to achieve a 25% improvement in performance. I think every agency took this to heart, and the communication was pretty thorough in terms of the administration to the agencies. The website was a tool to get every agency to come on board and to be able to compare results and find ways to achieve performance through the use of a more scientific approach. And so anyway, if you want to go to that next one, go ahead, Arun. In the current administration, we've moved from success.utah.gov to performance.utah.gov, and every agency is using a much more scientific approach. I think we've seen pretty much every agency is now using dashboards to track their success and communicate their success. And I think they're targeting, multiple stakeholders. Obviously, they want to communicate to their employees, and be accountable for what they're achieving through their performance measures. So every agency is reporting on this. You can see that some agencies have more performance measures than others. Obviously, the smaller agencies tend to have less. But there is a focus on accountability. This particular dashboard is not just, they've renamed the office now Planning and Budget, but it's a joint effort of the legislature, the legislative budget analyst, and the governor's office to communicate not only to agencies and to citizens, but also back to the legislature. And it's a tool for accountability in how we spend legislatively appropriated funds. So I think that's been a good tool. If you want to go to the next one, Arun. We also have really focused on transparency. With digital government, our focus has always been three things: information, services, and transparency or accountability. And so open.utah.gov is a place where we share all of our transparency initiatives, our open government initiatives. Three key ones are transparent.utah.gov, which every agency in the state, as well as every local government, is required. Cities and counties, special districts, education, higher and public, are all required to report their expenses to transparent.utah.gov. We probably have, I think, about 6 billion lines of data as part of that data set. So you can see expenditures for any state agency or any jurisdiction of the state. Open Records is a portal to allow access to any state records, make record requests. Data.utah.gov is where we share our open data. I think we've got 2,000 data sets there. So communication and accountability has become really important to us, especially related to how well state agencies are spending our state dollars, tax dollars. And if you want to go to the next one, Arun. So one of the things that I wanted to do is with all the agencies creating their own dashboards is have a tool where people could go and access all of these dashboards as they're reported instead of having to hunt for them or search for them. And this basically uses what we call our master data index. And so dashboards is just a type on our master data index, and that type has metadata that's associated with it so that we can track it by sector of the economy, if it's agriculture or business or transportation. We can track it by agency, but it's all using their their individual dashboards and tying them all together through a single portal that where it facilitates ease of access by all of the stakeholders, whether it's the legislature, agencies, employees, or the public. And we obviously use a variety of technologies. As the CTO, I try to standardize to the degree possible, but actually business intelligence is one area we've had a hard time standardizing because the technologies for reporting are always improving. And so we actually have a variety of tools that we use for business intelligence, including Power BI and Domo and Tableau and Cognos and Google's Data Studio. All of those are good tools. And increasingly we're using AI and machine learning to analyze the data that we have across the state. And we've got an AI Center of Excellence where we share ideas about the use of technology and particularly artificial intelligence within our digital government initiatives. Not just digital government, but that's sort of my focus. Anyway, that's a little bit about what we're doing and how we're using technology to communicate information about performance in Utah.
Fantastic, Dave. Thank you. Those 2 opening sessions, I'm so excited about them. Dave Gottesman, Montgomery County Stat Manager. I still got you here, Dave? Brianna, if I can't find him, I'm going to tee you up. Dave Gottesman, are you around? Oh, he's here. So can someone, Arun or Mary, can you unmute Dave Gottesman? Thank you.
Yes, Sherry, I'm actually.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, I was not allowed to unmute myself.
Yes. Sorry, I was also bringing up your PowerPoint.
A power that my colleagues wish they had. Please, it's great to be with you all today. Are you gonna, Arun, are you gonna bring up my slides, or would you like me to? Okay, thank you. Yeah, perfect. All right. Let me just say before I start that if you have never been to Colorado or Utah, they are 2 of the most beautiful places in the United States. So as the world loosens up a little bit, I hope that people will go and contribute to their tax base. I'm sure my co-presenters here would, they didn't tell me to say that, but they are spectacular. But I'm going to bring us back to the East Coast. If you're not familiar with Montgomery County, Maryland, we are the largest jurisdiction in the state. On the little map there, that little screenshot, the triangle at the bottom is Washington, D.C. So we're a first ring suburb of Washington, D.C. We have just over 1 million residents, about a 10,000 person workforce, and we are a full service local government that does everything from public safety to COVID vaccines to libraries and recreation and permitting and potholes and bus service and pretty much everything a local government can deliver. County Stat is the performance management data analytics team for county government. We have 2 primary roles that you'll hear a little bit more about in the next few minutes. The first is the kind of the classic stat office. In terms of oversight and accountability and developing for performance metrics for all of our different departments and operations, and monitoring them and reporting them out and getting involved when things are going off the rails and so forth. And then the second hat is more of a internal consulting type role. That's the data analytics role. And what we do in that respect is we try to help our colleagues in county government to use and leverage all of the vast amounts of data that we're sitting on top of in all of our different systems and applications for more informed decision making and discussion and policy making. And we do that through delivering a variety of products like maps and graphics and charts and dashboards and reports and other analyses. So what I'm going to do with the next slide is I'm going to take us through a little bit of the evolution of stat in local government. Dr. Metzenbaum wanted me to convey some of this. This is just Montgomery County's experience, but from talking to a lot of my colleagues around the country, there is, there's been a fairly similar path that a lot of my counterparts in other cities and counties in the United States have taken. So starting in the upper left quadrant, what I will call 1.0, people who have been doing this for 15 or 20 years might recall the many, many field trips that mayors and county executives and town supervisors took to Baltimore, not only 40 minutes from where I'm sitting right now, to see Martin O'Malley and what he was doing with City Stat in Baltimore before he was governor and created State Stat that Dr. Metzenbaum mentioned. And in the 1.0 stat model, which everybody, including Montgomery County, went and learned and then came back to their homes and kind of bolted it on to their operations. It's very much a top-down command and control kind of structure where the stat team is part of the executive's office and they, quote, sit on top of the agencies or the departments, and they do their analyses and they do their performance sessions and kind of, tell them, what's what from the top down. But in Montgomery County, and I think in a lot of other places, that model, there was a time limit on that because the culture of our county is it's very collegial. There's a lot of collaboration and that kind of tough stat model, as it's called, or very, confrontational by reputation anyway, kind of model didn't really work for us. So the 2.0 model, which you also saw, by the way, a little bit more of in the state stat model under O'Malley, was more collaborative, more issue-driven, more cross-agency, cross-departmental focused, where the stat team would act as a convener almost, and there would be an issue that you could not move the performance needle unless you had multiple stakeholders at the table, all sitting around the same data or the same maps or the same analyses and agreeing on those and then figuring out where to go from there. So that's the circle model, if you will. And then moving on to the 3.0 model, what is interesting about this step is that this represents an administration change. We in state government, local government, federal government, you have administration changes, and the priorities and the thought processes and the way a new administration wants to operate is going to dictate your performance operations to a large extent. So we had a new administration come in about 3 years ago, and the chief administrative officer and the county executive, they wanted to almost go back to the 1.0 because they needed to wrap their arms around county government coming in new, but they didn't want the same approach. They really wanted not just to emphasize accountability, but to emphasize collective learning. They really wanted to change the culture of the organization. So what you see here, and this, again, the stat team is kind of in the middle, we sort of drove this process and what the circle represents, it was branded Turn the Curve, but it's essentially a strategic planning process that's grounded in data and evidence. In the first step, when you establish a performance measure, and then you develop a strategy to move the needle or turn the curve on that performance metric, and we guided that process, and the meetings around those specific measures in the turn the curve process almost replaced sort of the general performance metrics that we met on before. And then moving ahead to 4.0, which is I think where we are now, is what I'm seeing is a little bit more of a distributed model where all of the analytical horsepower does not necessarily reside in a county stat team or a city stat team, just in the executive's office, but because we have all these digital natives entering the workforce, and because the technology has spread and the governments have invested in it, individual agencies, individual departments, they want a stat person. They want an analytical person in-house just for themselves. So I have colleagues now in county government that didn't exist 2 or 3 years ago, who are a data literate person or a skilled data person but focused just on one department or just on one kind of operation. And then the county stat team, my team, is more broadly across county government. And we interact in a lot of ways. Often there are touch points into those departments or those agencies. So it's a little bit more distributed. So I've taken up more of time than I wanted to with that, but let's move on to the next step. I'm going to go through this very quickly. These are just some other kind of important elements of how county stat evolved over the years. And all this slide, this very busy slide, is saying is that we went from being very PowerPoint driven, where we would have these very traditional meetings and analysts would spend an inordinate amount of time, updating the last PowerPoint deck for the new meeting with the new data. And we took a step into 21st century and invested time and effort into learning tools like Tableau and Power BI and our statistical packages and so forth to automate the data, the data collection, automate the updating, that when you opened up the new dashboard or you opened up the new map, it would populate automatically. And that allowed us to devote more of our time to actual analysis and less time to just packaging stuff. So that was a nice step. If we can go to the next step, the next slide rather. So another piece of our evolution that kind of took us out of that 1.0 mode is in Baltimore with certainly at the beginning of CityStat, many things were awful and every problem, every agency sort of had to be a nail that the hammer, the tool, the meeting had to be able to fit. And what we realized in Montgomery County is that we operate fairly well. We are a high functioning organization. We have a lot of great subject matter experts. We do things pretty well. Not everything's great. Not everything's even good all the time, but we took a much more tailored approach to each department and each issue, that we sort of started to shed the recurring meetings for every single department if they were just getting too repetitive. And we might have a monthly stat session for a department that had acute issues and really, was in the red, so to speak, but we might meet less frequently or do more ad hoc project-oriented work with the departments that were more higher functioning. So it was just more of a tailored approach rather than treating everybody the same. And then this last very busy slide, the next slide, thank you, is just people always ask, well, how do you get your work? How does your workflow, come into being? And there are four kind of lanes that we get our work. The first is when the county leadership says, this is important to me. The second lane, the data-driven lane, which I think is probably the most defensible, is when the data is literally telling you, look at me, there's a dip here or a spike here, there's something happening, and we'll investigate. The collaboration lane is something where, it's a cross-departmental or cross-agency kind of issue where we're not going to make progress unless we convene multiple stakeholders together. And then the fourth lane is the one that took a long time to get to, and that's where we built our reputation as being helpful and good colleagues and smart and kind of Swiss Army knives in county government. That departments started coming to us and saying, "Hey, we have a problem. Can you please help us?" So that's how our work plan gets formed through these kind of things. If we could go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about the communication piece now. So this is our website. You're welcome to visit. We have two, again, it represents the two halves. We have department performance dashboards, and then the whole community insights and projects and products tab, which is all of these interactive tools we built over the years that we turn out into the public domain so that people can use them and be more data informed with what they're doing. But the next slide should be a screenshot of a department performance page. So we use Tableau here, where we populate the performance metrics in the blue and for the actuals, and then we have projections or targets based on the kind of measure that it is in the gray. This is public, so we communicate this stuff out to the public, and then where we feel there's a specific internal audience, whether it's executive leadership or department leadership or management, we can communicate it to them as well. But everybody, like Ben's presentation, everybody's looking at the same information. The piece on the right, which I don't have a lot of time to get into, unfortunately, because I'm waiting for Shelley to put her minute finger up, is this is just our framework. This is we use results-based accountability, that philosophy as the underlying foundation for the county stat work. There are 3 tiers of measures. There's the how much did we do, the quantity, the widgets, how well did we do it? Thank you. I said how well did we do it, which is the quality of our work. What percent of a process met, an expected timeline and so forth. And then the ultimate measure, of course, in local government, the thing we're always striving for is the impact, the outcome, and that is anyone better off? So we categorize our measures these ways. We work with departments for each program in existence to identify a handful of measures to tell the story of each program through any of these kind of measures. I'm going to whip through the last 3 slides. To me, a powerful data visualization is everything, right? It's data, but it tells a story. It's that happy middle ground, that happy marriage between data and storytelling. And when you do it right, you see light bulbs go off. This example I'm going to show you is dated. It's 5-6 years old, but it's still one I use because it says something to me. In Montgomery County, people look at us and they say, you are a wealthy county. You don't need federal money. You don't need state money. You guys are doing great. And when you look at us on the average against all the other gray dots, which are all the other counties in the United States, and you plot the percent of the population above the poverty line with median household income, you will say, yes, of course, Montgomery County, you don't have any need, right? But if you go to the next slide and you unpack that data into our 215 different census tracts, you make it more, level more granular, and then you go to the next slide, you say, oh, wow, your average is being dragged up by all of those census tracts in the blue and other colors as well. But if you're going to do a more in-depth analysis, well then, wow, you really do have census tracts with people who are in need, and we need to target resources there, or we need to highlight that to tell a better story. So the very last slide are a couple of principles. I don't have time to go into them right now, but I would encourage anybody to look up Jonathan Schwabish from the Urban Institute. He promotes these 5 principles of data communication and things like pre-attentive attributes to tell the story. So that's something I'm happy to talk about later if there's time, but would love to promote his work. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave. That is fantastic. And now let me introduce Brianna Surid, who's the Communications Manager and Community Participation Officer in Amherst, Mass. And what's exciting to me is we talk a lot these days about inclusion, et cetera, and also the challenge of how do you engage? I mean, if you engage the community, you hear different issues, et cetera. It's not just inside the walls of government. Brianna, take us to what you've learned, please.
Great, thank you, Shelley. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'll look for a thumbs up from someone. Ben, thank you. I guess I have got the dubious honor of having to follow Ben and both Daves, but today I'm excited to briefly share with you the perspective of a smaller agency with a team of 1, myself, and our approach to leveraging communications and engagement to more broadly tell the story of our work in order to improve the civic experience of our residents. To be clear, we do not currently have a formal performance management system in place, but I will share our experience in trying to get one set up and some other ways we are currently communicating our work out to stakeholders. So just quickly, I know for the sake of time, my name is Brianna Sunrid. I have worked for over 10 years in communications, local government communications, innovation, and digital services. And prior to working in the town of Amherst, I served the city of Worcester, which is the 2nd biggest city in New England. So you just heard from my colleagues at the state level in Utah and Colorado, and from the most populous county in Maryland, who have been doing great work in this space for years. My perspective will, of course, be scaled way down to represent the work of a smaller college town in New England, who's been making increased investments in communications and digital engagement services over the last few years. And I'll also talk a little bit about our experience, lessons learned, and potential opportunities to leverage as we try to introduce a more formal performance management framework and culture of continuous improvement. But just quickly, a little bit about Amherst. We were only just under 40,000 in the last 2020 census, and more than half of that number Our thanks to our student population who come to attend the flagship university for Massachusetts, UMass Amherst, Amherst College, and Hampshire College. One other quick thing to mention about Amherst, if you've not had an experience with our town before, we do say Amherst where only the H is silent. We have an extremely active, engaged, empowered community who really has a voice in what we do and how we produce our services. So just a little quick context. I did mention a little bit about Amherst, but in 2018, we changed our form of government. If you're familiar with New England towns, representative town meeting or open town meeting is pretty common. But in 2018, we switched to a council manager form of government. And with that came an increased focus on transparency, participation, and engagement that was actually codified into our new charter. So that's just a little context for some of the work we have been doing since then. Oops, I'm going backwards here. Well, one of the questions Shelley wanted us to focus on was why do we track and communicate our performance? And particularly, why do we do that in local government? And, you know, the core, our purpose is the public, and our goals should be connected to, informed by, and to the benefit of our public. Our main audience is our community first. We increase transparency by telling our story and exhibit the value of our services, but also we use the feedback gained from these communications to improve or pivot. But with tracking and communicating performance, we also see benefits for staff. We see how their work across the organization aligns with the higher mission and values, and ultimately that of the community. And it informs how each department or function contributes to these broader goals. Some things to watch for, particularly in local government, not that this doesn't exist at the county or state level, I'm sure, is really, this is the way we've always done it mentality, or the silo effect. And so there has been some reticence from different departments or staff members to want to participate in a more formal performance management system, but especially how we communicate that out to the public. The other audience that we think about when we're measuring and communicating our performance is for leadership and our elected officials. This is especially true in local government, where we are in the direct impact zone of our services and programs. They know where to find us. Our offices are right next door, and we see this as a really strong tool for leadership and elected officials to be able to exhibit the progress being made or show where we need more resources to get the job done. Before I talk a bit about some of the innovative uses of technology to this end, I will say that the pandemic really paved the way for innovation in local government, in some ways more than other agencies who are already making headway in this space. We saw a rapid adoption of new technologies by both staff and the public because they had to. There were creative use and scaling up of existing technologies to get the job done from home and in new ways. And it really fostered a mindset of innovation and upskilling of our teams. And more importantly, for me, there was some really solid data and analytics on the use of our digital services and our virtual engagement opportunities to inform our decisions. So another question, that's posed is how can we use this technology to increase our communications, engagement, and transparency in local government? In Amherst, I've used several new or existing tools to help tell the story of our work and services, and at the same time highlight opportunities for more two-way communications with our residents in order to get that important feedback from them on how we're performing. Some recent examples over the last year or two that we've put into place, we're installing digital signs in our downtown area. We are able to push out information to these signs, but at the same time, we're able to prompt passersby on the street to answer some important polls on projects or initiatives in the town via text. Not only do we see those answers, other passersby can see the answers to those prompts from their fellow community members. We've done a fair bit of crowdsource mapping for blight and issues and use that for actionable events like community cleanups. We frequently use data and mapping from our issue reporting tool. One thing that we've started to do a lot more to communicate our performance is using ArcGIS interactive and web-based story maps to talk about what's being done with the budget. Right now, we're building one for our ARPA projects that we anticipate will be a hit with our community members. One of the bigger things that we did about a year ago was stand up a dedicated online public participation platform, which we call Engage Amherst. Encourage you all to take a look at that if you're interested, but really what it is we build out project pages for each one of our major initiatives, and we invite the community to interact with different tools to get their opinion and gather sentiment. Some of the tools, for example, are survey tools or idea generators, all the way to different mapping exercises for them to interact with the project in a way that's outside of a prescribed public comment at a public hearing. So it really allows for long-range public participation on an important project. We've started, because of the shift to virtual meetings, we've started to use in-meeting polling on specific agenda items to allow for real-time sentiment gathering from our community members. Again, another way to broaden the opportunity for public comment outside of that small window. We've done a lot of work with public interest technologies that we've co-created with the university here in town, and been able to sandbox them here directly in our meetings and in our spaces here in town. And we have looked at performance management software and public dashboards. If we had time today, more time today, I'd love to get into the specific use case for these examples, but can happily connect afterwards or answer anything in the Q&A. And I know I have to be on time. In the last few slides, I'll briefly share our experience and lessons learned from our attempts to design a more formal performance measurement strategy in our community. So before the pandemic, I participated in a national cohort for local government strategy and performance management. Again, Amherst was the little guy in that room with other participants coming from much larger cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, where they already had dedicated performance staff or teams. The program was designed to rapidly upskill participants in the area of performance measurement, management, and the sharing of results, both internally and externally. And they even gave us a year-long trial of a purpose-built software to get us going. So while the initial response was very favorable when I brought that back to my organization to pilot, then the pandemic hit and our priorities had to shift a little, but not without some lessons learned to inform our future efforts. First and foremost, I would say one of the chief challenges was buy-in and support from leadership. Depending on what your agency looks like, for us, that would be the town manager and our town council. The lack of dedicated staff and resources was troubling. I mentioned earlier, I'm a team of one, so trying to think creatively how to do something like this with existing staff. It became apparent we definitely needed a dedicated software to track and to dashboard results back out, which for a smaller municipality becomes a concern for cost and resources. The first three really will impact the ability to operationalize and to sustain a program like this. And the last two, I think, were harder to wrap my head around, a little bit more difficult for me to get over those hurdles, were just the general slowness with the organizational cultural shift in local government, not kind of being fast enough to understand what we were trying to do. So trying to find solutions to that, but also the shifting priorities of elected officials and how that impacts the goals that we're trying to measure.
Brianna, I think I need you to wrap up. And
Yep, I'm on my last slide. Thank you. So with those challenges in mind, there are opportunities to improve success on the local level. We've heard from my colleagues previously, and I was feverishly taking notes. But some of those opportunities I see are support and training from states or other partners, potential regional cost sharing of staff and technology. And the statewide or regional efforts would also assist us with standardizing and benchmarking capability. Employee incentives and automation through software. We saw that was evident with everybody's previous talks, and collaborations with academia or other partners. And here in Amherst, I'm looking at all of these possibilities to scale up our continuous improvement efforts, which we do link directly with communicating out results and receiving input from our community members. So I know that I've reached my time from Shelley. I could keep talking, but I am going to pause now as we're going to transition to the question portion.
Thank you very much. So I just get excited. That list of the ways you were getting information and communicating with the public was so exciting to me. Thank you for taking us to a new era. And I think it's now your turn to ask Dave a question.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Dave Gottesman. I'm going to butcher that, but from Montgomery County. Selfishly, what advice do you have for a smaller agency with limited resources to get traction or internal buy-in to sustain a formal performance management system?
Sure, and you didn't butcher it that badly. Better than most.
Thank
so
you.
I'm going to be more brief than my actual presentation because to me, I can encapsulate it in just a couple of things. A lot of times people will say the advice is, get embedded in legislation, and that is one option. That is one track to take, and that way your performance office is, you're there, you're in the charter, or you're in the laws, and that you're not going anywhere more than likely. Now, we're not, my office is not. So there are three things that we've tried to do to really sustain ourselves. We are in our second administration. So we have survived the transition. The first is pure relationship management. We spend a lot of time and energy and thought on making sure that we, pre-COVID certainly, but to the extent we can virtually, meeting the people that we work with, helping them understand who we are and what we do and what value we bring, how we can be helpful to them. And the fact that even though we want to be helpful, there is still an obligation on their part to, comply with the performance metrics, we want to help them do them the best they can and iterate them as needed, but there is an obligation, but also an opportunity for us to, to assist. The relationship management is huge. I encourage my staff to get out into the field. One of the most memorable days I've ever had in county government was a day that I spent the day with the fire department riding on fire trucks and responding to calls, because it builds credibility and it builds relationships and knowledge of how a department operates on the ground. That's really important. The second thing I think is just to try to stay as apolitical as you possibly can. In Montgomery County, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4 of the residents are Democrats. So it's not, there's not a lot of huge, political upheaval here and there. But even within county government, people have different opinions. We have a 9, soon to be 11 member county council. We just try to stay out of the political fights and keep things grounded in facts and data and evidence, and those are our watchwords. So it's actually a little easier. And then the third thing is to demonstrate value everywhere you can. The products that we create, whether they're dashboards or analyses or reports or interactive maps, or we provide things that a lot of people in government don't have the skill to do, or out in the nonprofit sector for the things that we turn out publicly. We're creating tools that simply deliver value, that make people's lives easier. They don't have to spend a month learning GIS. So because we made something that they can just click and have a really great map in 5 seconds instead of a month. So the value creation is really important too. I know we've talked a lot about communication and storytelling. I will admit that our strong suit is not marketing. So we do all these things, but I think admittedly, I would, and candidly, I would say that we don't do a good enough job of telling our own story, especially to the public. I think within government, people, know who we are and what we do and appreciate it. But out there in the public, it's not as much as it could be.
Yeah, and that gets to Honor's question about, was there an effort to inform the general public about your efforts and was it successful? So let me ask, as you're going to be asking Ken and Ben questions, so let me ask Ben to address that one too.
As well as mine that I'm going to ask.
Yeah.
Okay. So Ben, one of the things that you reflected on in your talk was you talked about outcomes, which are very externally focused, versus strategies, which are more inside government focused. So how do you straddle those two worlds, or maybe pivot between them without either diluting the message or confusing your colleagues versus the public who are actually doing the work?
Thanks, Dave. That's a great question. I'll start very functionally. So tactically, when we create what we call our wildly important goal, right, our performance outcome that we're really striving for, I have a team of analysts who work very closely with the state agencies who develop a theory of change. And that theory of change is basically a spreadsheet. And it kind of walks you from taking this big outcome level problem and breaking it down into bite-sized problems, but also doing a bit of an inventory from our state agencies about the programs that are already in place, where we're already driving money, where we're already driving outputs. And so there's this kind of top-down, bottom-up approach, and we kind of document it all. And then we finalize, this is our theory of change. Here's how we talk about outcomes. Here's how we talk about what we're doing. But I will say sometimes it is very difficult. I recently coached the Department of Public Health, who had a goal around healthy behaviors, healthy lifestyles, healthy weight, kind of broader outcomes. And I think we could all talk about why they were proposing a measure of BMI, which I think we all know is a really bad measure of that kind of thing. And so we talked for a long time about what the right outcome is. And the levers we have in our tool belt to actually create that kind of social change that the taxpayers and the public expect of us. And what we decided is we actually needed to more narrowly define that outcome. We can still focus on those kinds of healthy behaviors, but we have a population we already serve with our Women, Infant, and Children program, WIC, the federal program that talks mostly about nutrition goals. And so, we may not be able to influence the behaviors of every single person, all, millions of people in the state, but we definitely can for the people we're directly serving and already spending money on. So we talked about some of the, those still outcome level measures, but in a way that really has, we have more control over the behaviors and the outcomes, as opposed to things that we just kind of throw some stuff up on the wall and hope that the world gets better. And so I think that's probably the best way that I would respond to that.
And I'm going to ask Kevin Browner's question to you, Ben, which is, have you made an effort to inform the general public about what you're doing, and was it successful?
Yeah, so the best example of that, and this is part of the legislation that is required, the SMART Act requires SMART Act hearings. And so in the legislature, every single year, an agency comes in front of, the budget committee to talk about their budget requests, and, the committee of reference to talk about the specific legislation. But there is a public forum every single year for every single agency where we talk about performance, and we talk about the outcomes. We talk about the mission statement and the vision statement of every agency. Those are widely attended by stakeholders and partners in the community. And occasionally we highlight some of the successes through communications documents, press releases, tweets, that kind of thing, when there is a big win. And I kind of used that example about rural road improvements earlier. The challenge is most people, the kind of regular public, don't necessarily care all the time about the in the weeds analysis that we're doing. And so really we focus mostly on communicating the story to our stakeholders or the partners who are already well aware of the work that's going on. It's just a way to communicate the success of our programs to them. And usually there's kind of that sweet spot in the Venn diagram where, members of the public, but they're still interested in what our Department of Natural Resources is up to every day. And those tend to be the people who lean in most and care most and listen most.
Great, thank you. I think you were going to ask a question of Dave Fletcher.
I was. Dave, I am really intrigued about your AI Center of Excellence and have tried to do some similar things here in Colorado, but often run into challenges where there's public perception that it's just kind of big brother. You're the government and you're just going to be watching everything I'm doing. And I'm curious how you responded to that, and if there were the same challenges as you kind of stood up your AI Center of Excellence.
Yeah, I mean, I hear those kind of things regarding AI, but really AI is focused on efficiency and performance and improving the way we deliver government services. And I think we've done enough there with to show that we use digital government to improve things for citizens, that we don't get a lot of kickback on that. It's still evolving, you know. Every year we identify about 12 initiatives where we can use AI. We've been at it for 4 years now, and there's so many, whether it's in transportation or agriculture. An example is one where our Department of Agriculture was delivering. I mean, they have a brand book. And it took a long time when they got requests for new brands, to go through that book and try to manually match up and see what brands haven't been used and are they different enough from all the other brands. And it could take a month for them to go through all of that. And so using image recognition, they were able to reduce that to a matter of minutes to go through. And the same thing when cattle would be identified with a specific brand, somebody might send in a picture. It took a long time to go through and find out who actually owned that livestock. And so we take those kinds of successes and communicate them out to the public as well as to other agencies to show that really AI is about improving service. And so when we can do that, it helps grow the interest in that kind of an initiative. And overall, it's been very successful. We've worked to share some of the things we're doing in artificial intelligence with other states to show that it is a meaningful technology. And to me, it's really the technology of the future that's going to enable government to scale beyond where it is today.
That is so fascinating, Dave. And you bring up brand. It's a challenge we're dealing with too right now. And we're actually running a pilot to use blockchain. We think that the right technology to kind of map out the ownership of every image for every cattle rancher in the state, you know, maybe this is a good use case of blockchain in the state, which we've struggled to find a good use case for. So I may reach out to you and ask you how you use AI there in brands. That's interesting.
Sure.
Fantastic. So Dave Fletcher, I love listening to how you're thinking about this. And I also love that you've been around 30 years, so you don't have to be young to be able to have this innovation mindset, right? I think you're going to ask Brianna a question.
Yeah, you know, we always want to find ways that we can work better with local governments, being at the state level. And Brianna mentioned that she's a one-person shop. And so I was wondering, are there forums in Massachusetts that bridge between state and local governments where you get support, and also what kind of support would you like to see from your perspective from state governments that could be of assistance, and how would you like to see that delivered?
Well, those are both great questions, David. Thank you. I think right now in Massachusetts, we do have strong support in the form of grants from the state and from the governor's office, which is one of the problems we have is resources, right? So we often get money for IT or innovation projects, but what we sometimes don't get is, you know, the training or access to shared resources, which I think would take us a little further, especially in performance management. If there were some sort of shared software that all 351 communities, cities and towns in Massachusetts could use, and that was standardized, and we could get shared access to it, I think that would be something specific to performance management that we could really benefit from, and then be able to benchmark against our neighbors. So I think going beyond the funding from the state, training and those other shared resource opportunities would be really helpful to especially smaller communities, smaller cities like Amherst.
Fantastic. It's very interesting. I'm sitting here listening to you and thinking, okay, who in the state, you know, maybe the Department of Community Affairs or whatever thinks that's their job. I know that UMass Boston has the Collins Center, which had a StatNet network, which was the model of the Mid-Atlantic Stat Network. but it hasn't gotten us funded, but also maybe collective purchasing. You know, is what I hear you sort of saying. Maybe there's a group purchasing. Would that be helpful? What kind of, I mean, I'm going to poke on Dave Fletcher's question. Well, how could the state help? Any more thoughts about how the state could be helpful? And I'll ask the same with Dave Gottesman, who's also a local government. Is there ways the state could be more helpful? Or mostly do you want them to stay out of your way?
You want to go first, Brianna?
Oh, sure. No, I mean, in our case, any help that we can get to build capacity internally, especially linked up with resources like direct funding would be valuable. I often get one and not the other. So having both together, I think would really make a much bigger impact for us. And if that's coming from the state, which it usually is, either one or the other, pairing those two to make a more sustainable project and program. We've gotten vast amounts of money for some projects that we implemented and then couldn't sustain and had to abandon. And it really is sad to see that waste. So really pairing up resources with capacity building is, I think, what we would want to see from the state.
Dave?
So the way that I react to your question is, you know, what broadly, what could we use from the state? And I'm just thinking about it from a data perspective. And you actually alluded to this earlier. You know, Maryland was one of the first states to have a stat, again, because of Governor O'Malley. And then when there was not just an administration change, but a political party change, and because of that stat brand was so closely tied to the governor, you know, they not only did Governor Hogan sort of de-emphasize that role, he physically moved the team 7 miles out of Annapolis to Crownsville and changed the name to something that doesn't roll off the tongue quite as nicely. So I would like to see, you know, a resurgence of STAT in Maryland, but what we could use, I think, is probably just more robust data sharing. And it's not that it doesn't happen. You know, Maryland has a robust open data program, but sometimes it doesn't have, you know, what we're precisely looking for. You know, one of the issues that's come up recently is about, you know, who are the business owners in the county? And we're looking at that from an economic development standpoint, and how can we help people, and how do we do outreach and so forth. But that data, because of the way businesses get licensed, is often tied up in state systems that we just, you know, we have to tie ourselves in knots and, you know, hope that you contact the right person to get what you're looking for, if you can even get it. So, you know, more open channels of communication and data sharing systems is how I would characterize it.
Just mention, are you getting feedback? Sorry about that. Alan Shark mentioned an event that Napa is convening, which really is about this intergovernmental data sharing and everything is, and also what other kinds of supports, especially the local governments. And it'll be May 20th. I'll work with Arun to try and get you guys all the invite to it, because we're trying to figure out, okay, what are there some general recommendations, but then implementing the recommendations, because it is, I mean, it's exactly, Brianna, I think the issues you're raising. Let me thank this stellar group of panelists for, I mean, I was so interested. We have others who mentioned in the track, this is very informative. You gave us great examples, but you also gave us great senses of, okay, here's what I'm thinking about in terms of what makes it useful and how to make it useful, and talked about your technologies. Thank you so much for helping all of us learn, and for the work that you do. So exciting. I hope we can continue the conversation, all of us.
Thank you.
Passing it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Metzenbaum. Thank you, panelists. This is a fascinating discussion. You know, this is something that we were thinking about communication, and we were wondering, you know, how would we get the speakers, who would want to come and speak, and I think we really identified the best speakers to come on and talk about this topic. Thank you for showing us so much insights about what you do with communication.